Gentlemen, dear colleagues, we would like me and Dr. P.Anagnostis to thank the organizing committee and especially Dr. Kocha for inviting us to moderate this session. So we're back in time, a lot of it, but we will stay and we would kindly ask the presenters to stay on time up to 10 minutes, and after that we will have a brief discussion. So we start with the first presentation with Dr. F.Al Anouti with osteoporosis markets among Emirati females based on vitamin D receptor variants and biomechanical parameters. So Dr. F.Al Anouti.
Thank you so much. So first I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I can't say kalimera. I learned the word from my friend. But then, you know, he said if it's not in the morning, say afaristo, yeten, philoxen, yeah? I don't know if I did a good job, but, you know, thank you so much. I will be presenting today about osteoporosis and in the context of vitamin D receptor polymorphism. But before going into details, I would just give you a little bit of an idea about the status in the United Arab Emirates. So I know many of you here don't know about the United Arab Emirates. It's a country in the Gulf region, and it has different cities or different emirates. One of them is Dubai, and the other one is in Abu Dhabi. And I come from a university that is called Zayed University. It's a relatively new university. It's almost 17 years old only, because the country is new itself. So being a new university, working in a university is also very interesting. I'm not from Abu Dhabi, because a lot of people mistake me for being from the UAE. I'm not from UAE. I'm Canadian, originally from Lebanon. So just to clear things. But I work there, and a lot of my colleagues are actually Greek. So it's interesting. So we have two campuses, one in Abu Dhabi and one in Dubai. And so I will start talking to you about, so we've heard since the morning about the non-skeletal effects also of the vitamin D, and we all agree. I know there's a lot of debate in the room, but at least we all agree that there's well-established role for vitamin D in both skeletal and the non-skeletal. Although the guidelines may be different, the regimen may be different, but we all agree that there is a documented role for both. Okay, and so we know about all those well-established research studies that shed the light on the protective role, or at least that there is some kind of a protective role for vitamin D supplementation. And I know that there is, among some scientists or some clinicians, that there is some hesitation about supplementation. But on the other hand, there were a lot of studies and meta-analysis studies and RCTs, and that they showed over like 20 years of time, that they showed, for example, that supplementation at a very early age among Finnish, I remember, if I remember, Professor Grant, can you correct me on that? Finland, I think, was it Finland? That there's a very, very protective effect against diabetes. So whether we can act, and I think one of the speakers mentioned that for neurodegenerative diseases, so you have to think about what happens within a decade, a previous decade. So you can't just supplement when it occurs. Like, you know, you have to talk about the whole picture years before it happens. So that's why, you know, we kind of have to balance between whether it's safe to supplement or whether we have to be bold enough to supplement in all these issues. So if you think that in Greece, you know, there's disappointment, or in the Mediterranean in general in terms of what's going on for the vitamin D, and that you're disappointed with the results because the prevalence is a bit high, you can really imagine how the issue is, because it's really a big burden in the UAE or in the Gulf. And specifically, I say it's a big burden because in the Gulf, it's a country, or the region itself, like they are blessed with sunshine almost every day in the year. And nonetheless, the population in the Gulf is among the highest in terms of deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. So why is the population very deficient? Is because it's simple, like there are so many risk factors that will predispose the population. One of them is obesity, so it's very well known that in the Gulf there is a sedentary lifestyle, so people tend to stay indoor and not to really also be involved in any activity, and as a result they become obese. So obesity is one of the factors, and having an unhealthy diet and unhealthy lifestyle, as I said. Another factor is the skin pigmentation. So people there tend to have a darker skin complexion. And as we know, melanin is a natural sunblocker, so you can apply a sunblock, but you can also have a dark skin complexion, and both of them will predispose for vitamin D deficiency. And last but not the least, like there's avoidance of sunlight exposure. So people tend to avoid it, not intentionally sometimes, because people like me who are living there, myself, like I'm avoiding the sun because of the heat. So inadvertently you become vitamin D deficient. So in addition, also the extensive clothing and all of that was mentioned nicely by the previous speaker and one of the speakers in the morning. So again, here we're at kind of like a crossroad. We don't know what to do. There's the IOM, and is this enough? We have to make an informed decision. And I really enjoyed listening to the presentation by Professor Kotsa and Professor Spiros, where they tried to balance, to balance the situation. So you need to give the patient or the individual the right to choose. So you can educate, like there's an educational component also there, because you have to tell the individuals that there are other pathways or other resources, to obtain your vitamin D. So whether you can have supplementation, you can have food, but you can have also sun exposure, and you talk to them about the importance of balancing all these factors. Because I don't think, if you just sit in the sun by itself, there are some advantages or disadvantages. Also, like if you focus on only food fortification, it's not enough. If you just consider supplementation, it might be not enough. So you have to talk about the holistic approach, like the previous speaker. And I really think this is the best way to move forward. So what's the situation? As we said, in the Gulf, the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency is really high, and a lot of misconception was common before, because they thought that the males have a higher vitamin D status as compared to the females. But then a lot of studies later on showed that no, actually also males are at they also suffer from vitamin D deficiency. So different studies from Kuwait, let me see here, from Kuwait and from Oman and also Saudi Arabia and other countries, they also show comparable results that, these Gulf areas, they have a high prevalence of vitamin D deficiency. What was the picture like in the UAE? So before I moved to the UAE, there were just few studies. There were few studies that tried to look at the vitamin D deficiency specifically among pregnant women or women of childbearing age, and the sample was a little bit small. But then another professor, he's an endocrinologist actually, Professor Sadi, he tried to specifically look at osteoporosis in the context of vitamin D deficiency. So he was the first to kind of give the signal that vitamin D deficiency is very much associated with osteoporosis and other diseases like diabetes as well, and so on. Then came our study in 2011 and later in 2013, whereby we really were able to pinpoint the fact that vitamin D deficiency is a problem in the UAE. So before, as I said, like the studies were not really very focused, and whenever you wanted to apply for a grant to study vitamin D, either the funding body or like the university would ignore your grant because they would say like, it's not a big problem here. But then I had to, because I wanted to study the genetic polymorphism of the vitamin D receptor and its association with diseases, nobody wanted to fund me. Then I thought, okay, maybe like I have to go first by the epidemiological step and show them that it is really a burden. So this is what we did, and I was like lucky enough to have, you know, a group of clinicians and other researchers, and we were able to really document that for the UAE. So we published the first paper, which was about vitamin D deficiency and avoiding the sun among university students in Abu Dhabi, UAE. And the bitter truth was that only around 1% of the population, the young adult females, were sufficient, and the rest were either, you know, deficient or insufficient. And that was really, really very disturbing. And the reason why we did a similar study also among employees from other companies, and we found very similar relation. We also tried to work on association between vitamin D deficiency and depression. And, you know, we had some interesting results as well. But the bottom line here is that we tried to look at the risk factors and try to find out which risk factor was really more eminent here. And we were able to pinpoint the fact that sun avoidance was the major risk factor for the population. So we did some follow-ups, like, you know, we tried to come up with an intervention plan, like, so all these participants that were found deficient, we tried to educate them. We told them that, you know, you can resort to supplementation, you can focus on your lifestyle and all of that. But unfortunately, you know, we noticed that usually students, especially young adults, like, they don't like to take supplementation, for example, so they're non-compliant. So, you know, this is one way that is not really very effective with that age group. And when you assess their food intake for vitamin D, it's barely enough, like it's very, very weak. So we thought, like, you know, we have to come up with creative way to make them more exposed to the sun when the temperature is convenient. Because even though I said there is sunshine almost every day in the year, but there are some months, like, for example, it starts from March till maybe June. The people, they can enjoy that period by being outdoors, and the temperature is actually not very harsh, so they can get their sun exposure from there.
Dr. Anouti, 2 minutes.
Okay, sure. All right, so I'm gonna skip. So I will go to one factor that was kind of like not highlighted clearly, which is genetics. We forgot to also mention that, you know, there's a genetic pre-component for predisposition of vitamin D deficiency. And actually, we have done some work, me and my colleagues, and we've seen that, you know, for the Emirati population, there is some association between the vitamin D receptor polymorphism and link with type 2 diabetes, which is very prevalent also among that population, and other diseases. So just very quickly, I'm sorry, you know, I wasted my time talking about the status, but very, very quickly, I just want to tell you that, you know, we try to look at osteoporosis. Why osteoporosis in the UAE? Because also in the UAE, osteoporosis is really high, the prevalence is high. It's either osteoporosis or osteopenia even. And what we try to do is we try to look at a sample of 400 participants almost, 200 by 200 in terms of the control. And we try to do some molecular work. So we want to collect the DNA and to check the polymorphism of the vitamin D receptor specifically, and try to link it with biomarkers, biochemical markers and biomechanical markers, and try to find a model of osteoporosis risk specifically for the Emirati population, because I'm one of the researchers that really believes that population-based studies is very, very important. So I'm not going to go in details about that, but, you know, we chose one of the SNPs that is really by literature is very well documented to be associated with osteoporosis, and we did our study, and we noticed that in our, I'm going to go in the methodology, we noticed that there is actually a significant association between one of those SNPs that I mentioned before and risk for osteoporosis. So what are we doing later on now? We're trying to look for other candidate genes. We're also going to look not at the vitamin D receptor genes, we're polymorphism. We're going to target also the CYPs, 27B1 and 24A1, because really we think that both the vitamin D receptor and the CYPs are important in terms of what vitamin D can do. And finally, I would like to thank my collaborators and our funding agents, and thank you so much for your patience, and we're open for questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm
Sorry,
sorry pressing you for the time, but it is very crucial. So I think next presenters have to go straight to their methodology to be more flexible. So are there any questions for Dr. F.Al Anouti? Please. Please, sir.
Very good. Yeah. Yes, we're using LC-MS, actually. We stopped using diazorin or like immunoassays and because all of those conflicting results and the epimers with Roche and everything, so we use LC-MS now.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One brief question. Is there any association between some specific vitamin D receptor variants and osteoporosis or fracture risk? Because there are many data that both osteoporosis and fracture risk is mainly genetically determined. Have you selected some vitamin D receptor variants that are specifically tied to increased fracture risk?
Yeah, this is like what we did in the literature. I'm sorry, we didn't have time to go through it. But we specifically chose those SNPs, I think 10, like the SNP that ends with 10 is associated with fracture risk. But again, there is conflicting results because it depends on the population. For some population, it was associated with fracture risk, but with others, it wasn't. So, but in our study, it was actually.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's proceed. Okay. From my side, I would also like. Thank you very much. From my side, I would also like to thank the